But there is a big challenge, and I think Singapore is feeling the same. The dropping fertility rates that is, find in all Asian countries, in particular East Asian countries. In particular, in countries with a large population that is influenced by the Confucian cultural background. That's China, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and partly Singapore, all dropping fertility rates. And I explained that with the fact that these are all cultures that place a tremendous amount of value on education, educating your next generation with the best that you can get, so that they can succeed not just for yourself but for your family. And that drive has been what drove the economic successes, the human talent that went into the development. But now it's a huge drawback when young couples realize it's going to take so much to have children and to give them the education that can lead them to successes. And certainly that's what's happening in South Korea. I think maybe not to a similar extent, but to somewhat that element in all of these countries. And Singapore also is, I think, below 2.1. It has been for a long time. But you are already a multicultural country. You have many migrant workers. So how would you advise the Singapore leadership to deal with this? How would you advise other countries deal with this issue?
Well, I must say that, one of the reasons for Singapore's extraordinary success is that Lee Kuan Yew was an exceptionally brilliant politician. And in my book, I tried to describe how cunning he was and how he would always find creative solutions to many problems that Singapore encountered. But I must say, one problem that Lee Kuan Yew failed to solve was the fertility problem. He tried very hard. I never saw him work harder on any issue than the fertility issue. And sometimes he said things that were politically incorrect. He said something like, maybe monogamy was a mistake. No other political leader could say that and get away with it. Despite that, but it is. I must emphasize, it's a real challenge. But it's spreading around the world. More and more countries are having lower and lower birth rates, and Singapore is one of the lowest. The only slight advantage that Singapore has as a country is that, in Japan, for example, is a monocultural country. And it's very difficult for foreigners to be accepted in Japanese society. You're either Japanese or not Japanese, right? You cannot. I remember when my niece, my elder sister's daughter, was born in Japan, the Japanese emphasized in the birth certificate that she's not Japanese. They emphasized that in the birth certificate. But in Singapore, we are multicultural. So we are 75% Chinese, 15% Malay, 8% Indian. So we are used to diversity. And so when people come to Singapore from overseas and migrate to Singapore, it's easier to fit into a multicultural environment because it's a society that accepts diversity. But at the same time, I must emphasize that we do also have, this is shocking, anti-immigrant sentiment in Singapore. Quite shocking, it's there. And what is even more shocking is that when you have Chinese coming from overseas, it's the Singapore Chinese who resent them. And when you have Indians coming from overseas, it's the Singapore Indians who resent them. And that's bizarre. In theory, they are the same ethnic group, they should be able to get along. So it shows you that social integration is actually very, very difficult.
It is.
Very difficult. And we have developed tribal instincts, and we can smell when someone is a fellow member of our tribe or not a fellow member of our tribe. So, for example, Singaporean Indians and Singaporean Chinese quite often become very good friends, and there's a very large amount of intermarriage between Chinese and Indians in Singapore. And it shows you that there's a kind of a Singaporean identity developing. And so a Chinese, an Indian, or even a Malay coming from overseas would still have difficulty fitting in, although many of them do, I must emphasize.
No, I think the problem with Japan and Korea, who have traditionally been monocultural, mono-ethnicity, to open up now to other people coming in, it's difficult. So that's the mental block of the country going multicultural. Singapore is already multicultural, but you also say that there is an anti-immigration sentiment. I wonder if that has to do with the size of Singapore as a city-state. So you have this idea that it has limited space. Do you think that's... Yeah.
Very limited space. But at the same time, what I'm going to give you is a secret. We are actually quite expansionists. Singapore has reclaimed more land than I think any other country has, as a percentage of its territory.
And would that be an ongoing project?
No, there are limits, because we have neighbors, so we cannot grow. And we are very careful. We respect our neighbors. Whatever we do, we don't do anything that upsets our neighbors. But we have expanded our territory, and therefore you have urban planning in Singapore for the next 50 years.
See, long-term planning.
And so they already set aside blocks of land, newly reclaimed land that is unused and kept ready and available. And also I must congratulate Singapore for its sort of like far-sighted thinking on land use. I give you a simple example. It is very expensive to reclaim land, by the way. Again, we are fortunate we have the money, we can do it. But when you reclaim expensive land, what do? You set up skyscrapers and you get tremendous economic return. You know what Singapore did? It took this very expensive land and created a whole new botanic gardens. You make absolutely no money from these botanic gardens, but it creates a sense of happiness in your people. So we have this remarkable new garden set up on very expensive reclaimed land, which actually even the Financial Times said was one of the remarkable things that has happened in Singapore. We have a traditional botanic gardens in Singapore, which the British created, which is wonderful. It's really one of the best preserved botanic gardens in the world. And now we have a new one on reclaimed land. Why? City 50 years from now will need additional botanic gardens.
So I think this long-term thinking is increasingly difficult for countries that are swayed by populism. And I think that's the wisdom of your leadership, is not being swayed by populist sentiments. And that enables them to go to the long-term direction.
偷偷告诉大家，我最近发现了新法宝 Royal Face 逆时奇迹系列，它有活肤露、全效精华，还有精华霜。尤其我皮肤比较偏干，所以我非常的注重保湿。保湿做得好，肌肤自然烹润。提亮肤色更年轻，抚平皱纹超有感，而且气色变好。用心保养，每天都更美一点。美吧。